A little while ago, I opined in my 2 years on video for Resident Evil 7 that I'd not thought about it much since it came out, and that perhaps the reason for that was that it didn't really need thinking about. The game wasn't designed to be mulled over or mused upon, nor was it for those so inclined to pick apart neat little hidden threads in its narrative. It was a return to roots of sorts for the Resident Evil franchise, and whilst it had its problems, it was an excellent one. I don't know if it's necessarily fitting that Village really disappointed me, given how in the long run I'd consider myself ambivalent on Resident Evil 7. Neither of them are terrible games at all, though I do prefer 7 over Village, something we'll get into later. But for me personally, they're not what I want from Resident Evil, or really what I want from survival horror at all. After how well 7 was received and how praised it was for its stronger horror leanings, it strikes me as strange that Capcom chose to go in the opposite direction for a good chunk of Village. And it's largely that particular third of the game that lets it down. I know that Resident Evil 4 did the same thing, focusing on the action rather than the horror, but that game was deeply self-deprecating, full of ridiculous humour, and never bothered to try to take itself too seriously. Village, by comparison, is a much more serious experience, with a stronger emphasis on an emotional storyline over making fun of itself the way 4 did. At some point I will be going into heavy spoilers during this video, but I will let you know when that happens, so for now let's get a quick summary review of the game out of the way. For the first time in a long while, Village is a direct sequel to its predecessor in the franchise, in which you once again control Ethan 3 years after the events of the Baker House in Dulvey, Louisiana. Ethan and Mia have been moved to Europe by Chris Redfield and his team, apparently to get them out of America into a safer, more secure location, and have brought a delightfully uncanny valley baby girl into the family. Tensions remain high though, as Mia seems intent on forgetting everything that happened in Louisiana, as Ethan grows increasingly more paranoid about their situation. The game kicks off with a truly gorgeous Coraline-style fairy tale passed down as a local legend in the unspecified region of Europe, though it's somewhat confirmed online to be Romania. And this book, entitled Village of Shadows, rather obliquely sets the tone for the confrontations to follow. After a horrific event tears his family apart, Ethan embarks on a quest into a mountainous snowy village besieged by monsters and watched over by 4 unique lords, so that he can rescue his daughter, Rose. It's difficult to get into much of what really makes up the meat of this game without going into spoilers, so I'll begin with a discussion on its appearance and mechanics. I played Village on a PS4 Pro with the HDR engaged, although how well this comes across in the footage will vary depending on how happy my Elgato was at the time. Village is far larger and much more impressive in scope and scale than 7 ever was, and it does look very good. There were many times when I was struck by the atmosphere of not just the indoor areas but the village as a whole. Particularly in the first 2/3 of the game, Village makes fantastic use of darkness and creeping fog to instill a sense of foreboding, and the particular atmosphere you get, as well as the weather and lighting effects used to oppress you, vary depending on which lord you're fighting against. Of particular note is the game's second lord, Donna, whose area is drenched with a thick fog and is undoubtedly the purest, most effective period of prolonged horror in the entire game. I'd hasten to say it's far more effective than anything 7 ever had, and is easily one of the most tense parts of any Resident Evil game in the last 20 years, rivaled only maybe by Lisa Trevor. Despite the stress test it put on my aeroplane of a console, the game ran flawlessly, and I experienced no bugs of any kind other than the occasional frame drops. The design of the village and many of the game's interior locations have been meticulously thought out. As was the series' staple until Resi 4, the maps have a habit of looping back on themselves with unusual and intricate shortcuts, unlocked through a combination of progression and exploration. Early on in the game, you'll come across locked gates that require a specific item to open, wells that need a crank, gateways that are temporarily blocked off. Each of these are marked on your map, and taking stock of them, even in your periphery, subtly encourages you to come back to earlier areas once you happen across the item you need. In particular, the titular village, whilst a little small, is a haven of narrow, winding pathways, increasingly horrific scenes of destruction, and plenty of treasures that you'll need to return to over the course of the game if you're on the completionist path. It's never difficult to figure out what item is needed where, nor how to reach an area. Once you enter the village, the way immediately behind you is shut, and the other parts of it are locked behind particular keys, making it clear which parts are available to you at what time. The further you progress, the more you unlock, and as a result, the items you can loot increase in value to accommodate for the growing difficulty of fights and expense of upgrades. Progression, of course, brings back the traditional Resident Evil inventory management and treasure hunting, with combinable treasures returning as well as an overhaul of the inventory itself. It's fashioned more after the attaché case of Resident Evil 4, so you're encouraged to act conservatively at the start of the game, taking only what you need until you have the cash to purchase a larger case. Crafting items no longer take up space in the main inventory, instead relegated to their own dedicated section, a much needed change that is very much appreciated. Hoarding these crafting items is now much more viable, and especially on harder difficulties, not having to choose between a bigger gun or a metric ton of metal scrap means that you can make space for other, more important items. Like other massive guns, or that one DLC samurai edge weapon that is comparatively bollocks compared to the basic handgun, and can't be upgraded anyway, so why waste the inventory space? And in a small but deeply irritating move, there is no ability to auto-sort your inventory, so if you pick up something that takes up 6 slots, and you have 6 slots free, but they're separate across different parts of the case, the game forces you to play inventory Tetris instead of automatically realigning everything for you like 4 did. This is such an obvious oversight that it feels deliberate, and all it does is make me hate the inventory screen every time I manually have to crowbar a slice of meat in between several excessively large guns. On the topic of inventory and upgrades, the same mechanic of upgrading weaponry from Resi 4 has been brought in, with the amount of upgrades you can buy for each weapon limited based on what part of the game you're at. So you can't max out your gun's firepower until you're right at the end of the game, which makes perfect sense. Similarly, you can only buy the largest attaché case in the late game area, and its hefty cost is relative to the amount of ridiculously expensive items you can find and sell. If you're desperately hankering for items, you can buy most types of ammo from the Duke, the game's merchant, a fabulous character who deserves his own DLC, as well as pipe bombs, mines and first aid, but these can all also be crafted, so it's up to you whether you save the best crafting ingredients for ammo, or use them for other items like bombs and health juice. One aspect of upgrading weapons that I did appreciate being carried over from Resi 4 and 5 is the ability to completely refill an empty gun clip by upgrading its ammo capacity. It's a small thing, but in a pinch, it could save your life. There's also a cooking mechanic, which is one of the strangest things I've ever seen in a Resident Evil game, and that's saying a lot. It's not overly complicated, and every upgrade can be acquired in your first run of the game by hunting the local wildlife to extinction. The only problem is that the cooking mechanic is introduced sometime after you can acquire the first rare piece of meat in the game, and since there's no indication it's of any significant value, I assumed it was just something else to sell. So I sold it, only to find out an hour later that it was needed for one of the upgrade dinners, which was a tiny bit irritating. Meat can also take up a lot of space in your inventory, so it's best to save hunting until you're desperate for upgrades or until the last possible point of the game, when you're able to explore the entire village without interruption. Whilst I'm complaining about little things that irk me in the game, there's no local storage box like there was in 7, so you need to be extremely choosy about what guns you take with you, and if you don't have the cash for a bigger inventory, or if you've already maxed it out and happen across yet another gun in this small abandoned European village, you can't store them. You can't store them with the merchant, and you can't just drop them somewhere and come back later like you could in 0. I understand this in theory, but considering that there are trophies and completion points used to buy extras that require you to fully upgrade every weapon possible in the game, it means you'll be dragging around guns that you neither want nor need purely for the sake of completion. And believe me, there is nowhere near enough space in the largest inventory case to fit every gun you can get. The best way to manage it is to sell the gun to the merchant once you're done with it, then pay to get it back. The gun keeps all its modifications and upgrades in between, but I'm loath to have to do that when I could just chuck them in the back of his enormous wagon instead. Since the game has 4 lords and each of them has their own dedicated area of the map, the design philosophy of the looping shortcuts carries over to their locations, although none is more intricate and grandiose than the castle proper. Like the village, and very much like both the Spencer Mansion and the Baker House before them, Castle Dimitrescu, I'm not sure, I'm very sorry, is a gargantuan abode filled to the brim with utterly ridiculous and delightful puzzles, but unlike both of those, the castle is a glistening shrine to wealth and opulence with huge paintings of huge ladies on the wall, overly ornate fireplaces that are permanently blazing, and entire rooms hidden behind a shelf that's used to display just one bottle of wine. In keeping with the theme of each area you visit, Capcom have taken on board the criticisms of enemy variety in 7 by having each area feature a unique main thrall alongside its villain. Although they're all essentially a different variation of the traditional zombie, they have a unique look and feel to them, fighting in varying styles, and requiring a shake-up of your tactics to combat them. The castle itself rarely features enemies in its upper floors outside of the lady and her daughters, but in its dark, dingy basement lie the true horrors of the Dimitrescu reign, and it's made all the better for it. Nowhere feels safe in the castle, and no matter what you're running from, the intricate hallways and gleaming sculptures never feel like a real reprieve. As you progress, you'll be routinely chased by one of the 4 ladies of the house, and whilst there are those rooms that they can't enter, just like in the Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes, the way the scripted sequences tend to play out and how suddenly the ladies drop in on you means you can never be confident that you're untouchable. It's a true shame, then, that the castle is the first area of the game beyond the first part of the village hub that you visit and lasts for a criminally short time. Considering that the marketing was all over the large lady and her generous assets, it's astounding how little she actually features in the game. Lady Dimitrescu and her daughters, Bella, Daniela and the other one, are all encountered within the first 1 to 2 hours of your game, depending on how much you explore, and they are all dead not long after that. The castle itself lasts for about 2 hours in total, depending on how thoroughly you explore, and even then that's a serious push unless you're playing on the hardest difficulty. There's plenty to see and plenty to do, with some fascinating insights into the decay of the castle and the servants it once boasted, but it all feels extremely flat when you've blasted your way through 3 daughters in a matter of minutes. This was the first sign that the game wasn't going to be what I wanted, and this was only exacerbated when I reached the abode of the second Lord, Donna, and finished it within half an hour. Much like The Evil Within 2, the game has far too many villains, and as a result it doesn't have enough screen time for them all to be properly enjoyed. Far and away the most interesting villains are the ladies and Donna, the latter much more so in just how purely psychologically horrifying her section is. It's criminal how underused these characters are, and Capcom certainly knew what they were doing when they focused every single trailer around the large-breasted lady with the long legs and the big head. And yet for all the focus Capcom put on them, they barely have time to shine in their own house, let alone the game itself. The daughters and their mother are a fascinating brood, but you'll have killed your first daughter within 20 minutes of entering the castle, and even if you're paying extreme attention, the only way you'll know which one of the daughters you just killed is if you bloody well Google them. I only worked it out based on the voice actresses, as I recognised Nikki Lee Tompkins' voice as being the second daughter that I off, and went with process of elimination from there. The lady herself barely gets any more screen time than her own daughters, aside from being the final boss of the castle, to the point that basically every single one of her scenes is shown in all the trailers. She chases you around the house a few times, but it's all just pissing in the wind when barely a few hours after booting up the game, the primary focus of its obscene marketing budget is already dead and dust. Strikingly though, despite the fact that the castle absolutely should have been the focal point of the game, or at least was set up that way by the marketing team, it is still by far the longest and most intricate part of Village outside of the titular hub. The 3 remaining lords are obnoxiously short in comparison and feel deeply underdeveloped as a result. Whilst Donna has a fantastic house and atmosphere, an affecting backstory and some truly stellar voice acting for Angie in particular, her part is over and done with extremely quickly, and it's not long before you move on to Lord number 3. In terms of length, the only one that really rivals Dimitrescu is Heisenberg, but we'll get to that later. Like its predecessor, Village has a far more grounded story for the majority of its runtime, although it quickly becomes clear that parts of it are going to factor into the larger Resident Evil narrative at some point. On a fundamental level, Village is about a man desperately searching for his daughter, and in that regard it's handled quite well. Although a little off sometimes, Ethan is generally well acted and sympathetic, with a sheer bloody-minded arduousness to his demeanour that at times causes him to make impressively stupid decisions. The cast of characters surrounding him are also fairly well done, with each of the lords given plenty of personality, even if they don't have ample opportunity to shine, and Chris Redfield in particular, although unreasonably sinister at the start of the game, is handled far better than in previous games, although that's not hard, really. What's odd, however, is that the decision was made to give every one of the villains and villagers of this remote Romanian village an American accent. In theory, this is fine. Most games, and indeed most games set in scary foreign worlds, Splinter Cell, get away with this. But in this game it's particularly obnoxious, as there are several times when characters explicitly point out that Ethan is an outsider, And none are more so egregious than Heisenberg, the other focal point of the marketing. Upon meeting Ethan for the first time, Heisenberg refers to him as fresh American meat in his own deeply American voice, which is baffling, because the voice actor for Heisenberg is from the bloody English Midlands. I know this is a very odd point of contention, but if the game never pointed it out, then I would have written it off as just one of those video game things. But when the game specifically makes fun of Ethan for being American, in the voice of a villain who is himself American, it all starts to get a little bit irritating. It's not even like Resident Evil has done this before. The villagers in 4 spoke Spanish, and the few that did speak English had very strong accents. Silly accents, but strong ones nonetheless. Even in 5, the enemies spoke a nondescript, vague North African language. I'm not even going to pretend to know anything about North African languages. Or African languages in general, if I'm perfectly honest, and the few characters who did have an American accent were specifically pointed out as being American, so they weren't local anyway. So I don't really understand why this wasn't done for Village. There's no reason for this game to be set in Europe in the first place. It could as well have been set in some remote insular village in the American Midwest for all the difference it makes. It would have prevented the constant immersion breaking at the very least. As the game goes on, it becomes vastly more action-oriented, and there is an increasing sense of padding in the late-game section that started to drive me up the proverbial wall. It's very clear that most of the emphasis was put on Lady Jigglejugs and Heisenberg, and given how lengthy their respective chapters are, it seems like they were the first villains to be thought up, and the ones given the most budget. Although both Donna and Moreau are interesting characters, they are given nowhere near enough time to shine, and as a result of that, alongside how short their sections are, they might as well have never been included in the first place. Each of the villains are interesting, I want to strongly reiterate that, but there's too many of them for this one game. Village claimed to clock in at 9.5 hours on my first run on standard difficulty, but the actual time was closer to 13. A good chunk of that is spent with cutscenes and faffing about in menus, but there were also a good deal of repeated sections where gauntlets of enemies would endlessly spawn until I worked out which of the platforms I needed to stand on to advance the story. And when many of the enemies have auto-grab animations that can lock you into a 5 to 10 second long glorified cutscene, those parts of the game grew very old, very fast. I have some specific problems with the game that require me to go into more depth, so I'm going to issue a spoiler warning now. I'll be talking about the entire game in excruciating detail. And I'm going to specifically talk a lot about the many questions raised by various parts of the game's story, largely its ending. In brief, 2/4 of Village is pretty good, 1/4 is incredibly good, and 1/4 is obnoxious and far too long, but on the whole it mostly balances out. Depending on what you want from your survival horror action games, most people should find something to satisfy them here. If you enjoyed 7, it's likely you'll enjoy Village. I certainly did. Mostly. But for the die-hard fan of pure horror, there are several parts of it that are more likely to irritate. The first biggest criticism I have of this game is just how strongly it apes aspects of Resident Evil 4. There is the village you reach after a car journey that ends in disaster, wherein you are attacked on all sides by unlimited basic enemies and one very large enemy, who takes a lot of punishment but rewards you if you kill him. And after a set period of time, the enemies are all called away by the sound of a distant bell ringing. After that, you head to a castle occupied by a lunatic with several henchmen who must all be fought independently before you can fight the main boss proper, who then attempts to kill you with increasingly elaborate traps and grows more and more frustrated with each failure.
Your right hand comes off?
There's a section involving a lake with a giant mutant fish monster that must be destroyed, and the final lord operates out of an enormous and obnoxious factory that manufactures machine men. There's also the attaché case itself, the obvious merchant angle, and even the visual design of certain enemies, Angie and Donna being the most noteworthy, that strongly resembles the Plagas parasite. I know some people are hankering for a remake of 4, but for me personally, I neither want one nor really see the need unless it's to remove the QuickTime events. And we complained about this when it happened in Resident Evil 5. Resident Evil 5 was given a lot of shit for copying a lot of aspects of 4. So the fact that so much of Village is a direct parallel to events in 4 makes me wonder if this was a way to test the waters to see how people react before truly committing to a remake. All it does for me is make the game feel deeply stale. I've been here before, done this all before, why am I doing it again but in first person? There's a reason that 7 didn't have gauntlets of enemies. It's because it's a first-person game, and no matter how high you crank your FOV, you will never have the ability to plan and execute with precision, the way that you can in third person. And despite everything, you are still unable to lean around corners, something I complained about in my very first video on this channel and will continue to complain about for as long as it isn't implemented into any first-person Resident Evil game that Capcom puts out. The second and most profound issue that I have is with the game's story and the many questions it raises. Questions that are never answered, deliberately ignored, and either unravel the narrative in various silly ways or just make it clear that not a great deal of thought was put into the story despite what Capcom wants you to believe. On a very basic level, the story is fine, but any finer details are lost in the ridiculous faff that piles on top of every stupid decision that characters make throughout this game. Like the fact that if Ethan had just picked up Moreau's flask and left immediately, he would have been back out and back in the village before Moreau even noticed, but no. Instead, he stands there and mocks Moreau like an absolute wombat, and as a result, I have to get grumpy about the fact that this is just another fight with a really big fish. But first, before I get into that too much, I do have one thing I want to express my severe disappointment on. Resident Evil has never, ever been the pinnacle of storytelling. But one thing it has generally been pretty good at is elevating the fact that man's hubris and increasing obsession with sciences that should be left well alone is the cornerstone of all the difficulties that the characters face. Hubris created the T-virus and lost control of it, created Wesker, created Ouroboros, and all that and more. The writing has never been great, and good God would I not even try to suggest that Resident Evil is really an intelligent cautionary tale about the depths of man's madness and desire for power and control. But Umbrella, Spencer and Wesker worked so well in the original games precisely because they began as ordinary beings who took things too far. Innocent curiosity became an insatiable lust for power. Zombies might not be believable, but the nuking of a city to cover up a far more sinister reality buried beneath is certainly treading that thin line between fantasy and reality. I'm also not someone who generally cares much for stereotypes in stories of any kind. Stereotypes exist for a reason, and subverting them often leads to fun and clever results. With all that being said, I am deeply, deeply disappointed that Capcom decided to use Village as the opportunity to say that the entire reason that Umbrella even exists in the first place is because one woman went batshit crazy after losing her daughter to the Spanish flu. And not only that, but one of the people she chose to be a lord is also a woman who went fucking bananas after her daughter died. So good we had to do it twice. I hate this with every fibre of my being. I'm not going to harp on about it, but of all the things I wanted from this game series that did so well distancing itself from its silly origins in the last game, was for it to turn around and say bitch goes crazy as the reason for an entire saga of increasingly ridiculous apocalyptic thrill rides. But beyond this, there are also a good deal of general issues that I have with the game's plot and structure, and if you've been clinging on until now but haven't yet played the game, then this is both an urgent spoiler warning and an admission that the following diatribe won't make much sense if you're not at least vaguely familiar with the story. I'm going to now dramatically read to you, unedited, the full 2.5 pages of handwritten notes I made regarding this game's plot that I wrote during my second playthrough. Why, precisely, did Miranda divide Rose into 4 parts, then evenly distribute her between 4 lords to force Ethan to kill off the lords if she just needed the full giant's chalice to complete the ritual anyway, and if she didn't know Ethan was special, then why bother testing him at all, like Heisenberg claims? Why have him kill off the lords? If it's part of the ceremony, then why not do it herself? Why not kill Ethan right at the start of the game when she first kidnaps Rose, considering she ends up killing him later anyway? If she did, in fact, kill him in the van, then why is she so surprised when he gets back up for a second time at the end of the game? Why not actually offer him the chance to join her, since not doing so suggests Heisenberg was wrong about her testing Ethan anyway? If killing the lords is needed for the ceremony, then has she just never tried this with any other baby before? She could have implanted a baby with the Cado thing and tried. Did we ever actually establish how Miranda found out about Rose? Why did she keep Mia alive? What kind of experiments did she do? If Ethan is still infected, then so is Mia. She died too, several times, at Ethan's hand no less. Why is Mia in the same clothes still as Mimic Miranda was? What is the Cado? Is it from the Megamycete? Something else? Who were the 4 founders of the village, and why did they build the exact kind of ceremonial device chambers whatever that Miranda needed to perform this extremely specific ritual? I assume that the 4 founders knew about the Megamycete, but there's never a point in the game where their existence actually matters or has any tangible impact on reality, so why even bother including them? Hell, the game tells us that in her grief, Miranda just bloody well stumbled into a cave in the middle of Romania and happened across this huge mutant baby that no one else had ever found before. Are we really, truly saying that the entire history of Resident Evil is based on one woman who went crazy when her kid died? And also one of her lords is another woman who went crazy when her kid died? Why did Chris keep Mia's corpse in the same van as Rose and Ethan? Wouldn't that be horribly traumatizing? Also, Chris has been doing this long enough, he should have known that if it looks dead it probably isn't. In fact, he knows what happens when the mold is killed. He saw it happen at the end of Resident Evil 7, after giving Ethan the very weapon that killed Evelyn. I don't buy the excuse that Miranda mimicked a corpse, so did Wesker, and he came back 35,000 times. And why the hell did Chris and his team move the Winters out to the middle of nowhere, vague Europe maybe, but who knows, with all these American peasants everywhere? How on earth did he contrive to move them straight into the path of the worst possible danger imaginable? They knew Miranda had infiltrated the family, but didn't know enough about her beforehand to maybe settle Ethan and Mia in Germany or Poland or bloody Turkmenistan? Chris is an absolute imbecile. Really, though, how does Miranda know about Rose's power? Why does Rose even have powers if killing Evelyn got rid of the infection in Mia? If it did that for Mia, then there's no reason that Ethan should still be infected. Why is Ethan still infected? They both died.
You were murdered by Jack. You died there 3 years ago.
Bitch, Jack killed Mia. And Ethan killed Mia twice. If the barrier for entry for being still infected for plot convenience is this low, then bloody Zoe could have been the main character. Jack wasn't surprised when Ethan woke up at the dinner table, so why the hell would it be a shock for him to come back in this one? Also, how does Mia know he's still infected if Ethan doesn't know himself? Did she stab him in his sleep for the fun of it one time? How does Miranda not know about Ethan's regenerative powers if she knows Rose is so special? What exactly is this ceremony? Why even bother trying to bring your daughter back? Just raise Rose as your own. The ceremony obviously didn't work anyway, since she just comes back as Rose, presumably. Although it really isn't very clear at all what the purpose of the ceremony was and what exactly Miranda thought would happen, since she doesn't react as if something went wrong and Rose is still Rose at the end. So dividing Rose into bits was pointless. What was the BSAA's plan? Releasing zombies into the village. Why do we suddenly hate the BSAA? Why is the Megamycete baby-shaped? What is it exactly? Where did it come from? The books on the 4 lords in Miranda's lab show she wanted to use them as vessels to bring back her daughter, but they were all unfit. So why bother testing Ethan at all when she already knew Rose would be the best vessel? Her daughter is called Eva, so presumably she created Evelyn, or what would become her at least. So how did the company that Mia worked for get hold of Evelyn? I assumed they created her, but I guess not. Also, I love how we all just fucking forgot that Mia is military trained. In this, she is just another useless woman obsessed with her child who never even tries to fight back at all, and just screams about her special husband for the whole time she's on screen. What was the point of destroying Ethan's hand at the start of the game? If his heart regenerated, then why didn't his hand? He can glue his hand back on after it gets detached, but he can't regrow 2.5 fingers. I thought it might be that he got infected by the lichen at the start, but nope, he's been infected the whole time.
My power is leaving me!
Is it, though? Her whittering on and on throughout this fight is really annoying.
If I combine Rose with a Megamycete, my daughter will be made manifest at last!
Isn't that what you just did? And it didn't work? I don't even want to get into all the questions that the book brings up. Why does it even exist? Why on earth did Miranda use this to make Rose feel close to her when it has a somewhat happy ending that goes against Miranda's desires? Why did Miranda even bother infiltrating the family? Just to throw it in Ethan's face at the end of the game? There are still things I haven't even touched upon that I don't like about this game. I hate the fact that Miranda's boss battle, which in and of itself is a fine fight, all things considered, is constantly being interrupted by her and Ethan slinging insults at each other like a pair of children on a school playground. There is nothing more ridiculous and off-putting than the big baddie of an otherwise ultra super duper serious video game shouting die, 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 die. And after all that, the fact that you never see Ethan's face, even in his dying moments, feels like an incredible disservice to what little character he actually has. And I'm sorry, but I have to keep going. I really do not like the implication that the next game is going to feature a superpowered stroppy teenager as the main protagonist. We already had 6 power fantasy film vehicles for Paul W.S. Anderson and his cash cow wife, and nobody liked Jake in Resident Evil 6. I don't like the fact that the torch is context sensitive and can't be manually activated. It's very cool having the character's eyes naturally adjust to low light situations, but when you're constantly running into and out of very dark areas or squinting into corners to look for supplies, it becomes very tiresome. Miranda has wings, but she still left tracks in the snow at the start of the game, and don't hit me with it was probably another survivor from the truck. There were no other survivors. It's clearly stated that Miranda killed them all. The opening sequence is really cool, and I understand that the tracks are there to help guide you, but it just struck me as a little funny when it would have been cooler to see Ethan trudging round through unblemished snow, fumbling desperately for any signs of civilization, rather than just following the comical trail of giant footprints and dead birds. And besides, judging by the fact that it magically swaps from pitch black to daylight within minutes of entering this house, it seems to me that Ethan should have just hung around at the crash site for a little longer to catch the morning light. Even without the context of missing footage shown in earlier trailers, it's clear that the villagers you come across were supposed to have a much larger role in the story. It's all being cut out of the game to the extent that they are utterly worthless and only serve to waste time rather than generate any sense of intrigue or tension. Half of them aren't even named, and Eleanor's death is one of the stupidest things I've seen in a game in a while. She falls literally 3 feet onto the flaming bonnet of a car and instantly vaporizes. And speaking of terrible female characters, the fact that Eleanor cries, then immediately blasts her mutant father in the face with a shotgun before waddling back into her crybaby sad woman who dies of literal stupidity phase 3 seconds later is extremely telling of a character being hurriedly retconned to cut out any greater involvement that she should have had. And there are still things I haven't mentioned, but at this point I feel like I'm beating a dead horse and upsetting people, so I'll stop here for now. I guess in terms of ranking amongst the mainline Resident Evil games, Village is nowhere near the worst one. Resi 6 still holds that esteemed title. But in all honesty, whilst I would certainly prefer to play Village again in single player over Resi 6's single player campaigns, I'd be lying if I said I wouldn't just prefer to grab a friend to smash through the co-op of 6 instead. Resident Evil 6 is ridiculous, bereft of any real merit as either an action or horror game, and thoroughly stomps on the legacy it left behind, but it is still a damned funny game to play through with a friend. Village is just maddening in how much it does so well and how much of its incredible potential it wastes. Small little tweaks could have improved the experience so much, like having the first of the 3 daughters in the castle run away the first time you realise cold air can damage her instead of mindlessly keeping on at you despite the odds being stacked against her. Give Ethan an increasing sense of power, as he stops running from them and starts chasing them instead until the lady herself gets involved. Get rid of Moreau, get rid of Heisenberg, hell, get rid of Miranda for all I care. The game was so much more interesting when I thought that the vampire ladies were the only villains I needed to worry about, and as I butchered my way through them on release day, it dawned on me that Capcom haven't got any better at writing these games, they've got better at hiding how bad their writing is. Resident Evil 7 wasn't an incredible game, and I maintain that I really don't think about it often at all, but when I do think about it I usually consider it with fondness, rather than the irritation and disappointment with which I view Village. I'm starting to think that 7 was a fluke and we only remember it as being great because it was so very different to the horrible direction the franchise had taken before that point. And the Resident Evil 2 remake was great because it already had a strong, solid foundation built and just needed to update its graphics. Funny really, and quite fitting that the worst thing about the Resi 2 remake was its plot. If you enjoyed Village and are excited to see what comes next, I don't begrudge you that, I swear. But I really honestly hope that Capcom can recapture the essence of what made the first 3 games the pillars of survival horror that they continue to be. Because if Resident Evil 9 just turns out to be a power fantasy simulator set in the faint veneer of a zombie-infested pseudo-European city, then I will be done with this franchise that I adore so much. Well, I suppose I can hold out hope for a Code Veronica remake, because there is nothing in this world Capcom could do to that game that could possibly make me hate it any more than I already do. Oh my god, I didn't even talk about how much I hate the factory level.